In the worst storm the coast had seen in 40 years, I stopped thinking about job titles and started thinking about how long a woman can stay conscious in cold floodwater. Vivienne Blackwood, the chief executive who once called me an interchangeable logistics body, held my shoulder while lightning split the sky open above us. I pulled her through the current, found an abandoned equipment shed, and kept her awake until dawn. But when the helicopter carried us back to headquarters, Chairman Graham Blackwood read the rescue report, saw my name printed there in plain black letters, and went pale. He whispered 4 words nobody was supposed to hear. It can't be him. If you like stories where the man everyone underestimated makes an entire boardroom go silent, hit subscribe and stay to the end. My name is Caleb Harlan. I was 39 years old that autumn, and 2 days before the storm I was standing in a field operations trailer on the North Carolina coast, arguing with a barometer. Blackwood Meridian Group had put $420 million into a seawall and surge barrier project along 9 miles of shoreline, and the executive team was flying down to inspect it. My job was field operations coordination, which is a long way of saying nobody died on a site that could kill you 6 different ways before lunch. I had held it 11 years, and nobody in the executive tower knew my first name. The executives came down in a helicopter and 2 black sport utility vehicles with tinted glass and leather that smelled like a jewelry store. I came down in a 9-year-old departmental pickup with a cracked tailgate. I was not bitter about this. A truck gets you to the same place a helicopter does, and it gets you there in weather that grounds the helicopter. But there is a moment. Parking a work vehicle beside a machine that costs more than your house when you understand exactly how the people inside the building have sorted you. The weather models started disagreeing with each other on a Tuesday afternoon. Most people never see that happen because most people only look at the single smooth forecast printed on a screen. I looked at the spread. The tropical system 600 miles southeast had been projected to curve out into open water, and 3 of the models had quietly stopped believing it. Forward speed climbing. Central pressure falling faster than the guidance allowed. I printed everything and walked into the executive briefing room where I was absolutely not scheduled to be. Vivienne Blackwood sat at the head of the table with the posture of somebody who had never in her life waited for a table to be ready. She was 38, she had run Blackwood Meridian for 4 years, and she made decisions in the time it took other people to clear their throats. Beside her sat Lenora Carrington, vice chair of the board, 46, in a gray suit that had been built rather than bought. I set my folder down at the end of the table and said the afternoon inspection should be canceled and the executive party should move inland before the following evening. Lenora smiled the way people smile at a dog that has brought them something dead. She said that if the corporation halted operations every time a field employee looked up and saw a few clouds, it would have gone bankrupt in its first fiscal year. I opened the folder anyway and walked them through the sequence as it would arrive on the ground. Highway closures first, then the coastal road, then the low sections beside the drainage canal. Lenora turned to Vivienne and asked, in a voice pitched to Carrie, why the chief executive was spending 11 minutes debating meteorology with a logistics coordinator. Vivienne looked at me for what may have been the first time in 11 years. I do not think she saw a person. I think she saw a scheduling obstacle in a vest. She said the inspection would proceed because the board required a completed site verification before authorizing the technology transfer, and the transfer was worth $2.4 billion, and $2.4 billion does not wait for a low-pressure system. Then she trimmed 90 minutes off the schedule as a compromise. I did not argue further. Arguing would have cost me the little standing I had, and standing was the only thing I could spend later. At the door I stopped, because there was one more sentence in me and no good place to put it. I said, I hope I'm wrong. Vivienne did not look up. Later she told me the sentence had stayed in her head all afternoon like a stone in a shoe, and that she had almost canceled at 4 o'clock, and then had not, because the invitations were sent and canceling meant explaining. That is how most disasters get approved. Not by a villain making a decision, but by a competent person declining to make a second one. That night the Hurricane Center upgraded the warning and moved the projected landfall 30 miles up the coast. I sat in the motel parking lot with the engine off and called my daughter, 11 years old, staying with my late wife's sister for the week. She asked if I would be home Friday. I told her I would try, and she said trying was what I always said, which was fair. Then I sat there with the phone in my hand, listening to the wind change direction against the side of the building. Then I unfolded the storm map across the steering wheel and traced the new projected track with my finger, and I felt something cold move through my chest. The revised path did not just threaten the region. It ran directly across the section of coastal road the executive convoy was scheduled to travel the following afternoon at almost exactly the hour they would be on it. The inspection morning began in rain that came sideways in long gray sheets. I met the convoy at 7 and said again, in front of witnesses, that the verification should be aborted and the party should move inland immediately. Lenora Carrington was not there to hear it. Her helicopter had lifted off at 6:15 ahead of the ceiling dropping, and she had taken corporate counsel with her. That detail seemed unremarkable at the time. Later it looked like a woman who reads weather reports very carefully when the weather concerns her personally. Vivienne stood under the awning in a raincoat that had never been rained on and said she needed 40 minutes at the northern barrier section, no more, because the verification signature had to be dated before the board convened. I understood her position better than she thought. Blackwood Meridian had eaten 2 catastrophic losses in 3 years, a tunnel contract in Ohio and a port expansion in Louisiana, and the balance sheet had a hole in it shaped exactly like the Carrington deal. She was not being reckless out of vanity. She was being reckless out of arithmetic, which is more respectable and produces identical results. So we went. 3 vehicles, 6 people, 1 field truck, and a coastline already losing its argument with the ocean. We reached the northern section at 8:50. At 9:20, her assistant got an alert. The state had closed the interstate at the county line. At 9:31, the sheriff's department closed the coastal highway northbound. Our route inland had become a route to nowhere, and the only way back ran south along the low road beside the drainage canal. I put the field truck at the front of the convoy because it had clearance and a winch, and I knew every culvert on that road by its first name. We covered 4 miles before the water stopped behaving like rain. There is a moment in a coastal flood when the sound stops coming from above you and starts coming from beneath, and nobody who has heard it once mistakes it again. I heard it at 9:52. I stopped, got out into water already over my boots, and understood immediately that this was not rainfall. The relief channel had overtopped, a pressure gate somewhere behind us had failed, and everything it was supposed to hold was now looking for the lowest ground available. I got on the radio and told the 2 vehicles behind me to hold position and not advance under any circumstance. The second stopped. The third did not hear me, because a live oak came down across the road behind them in the same 30 seconds. And the driver of Vivienne's vehicle did what human beings do when something falls behind them, which is accelerate forward. He accelerated into a stretch that had 18 inches of water when he entered it and 31 by the time he stopped. The vehicle drifted, caught the shoulder, and settled at an angle with the current stacking against the driver's side. I have thought about the next 11 minutes more often than I like. I took the rescue line and the flotation harness out of the truck bed, tied off to the winch mount, and went in. Moving water at knee height takes a grown man off his feet, and this was at my thighs and rising brown and carrying fence posts and roofing and 1 entire aluminum ladder. The driver got his door open and made the tree line. Vivienne did not, because the rear door was pinned by the current and the electrical system had already drowned. I could see her through the glass, her hand flat against it, her mouth moving, and I could not hear 1 syllable over the water. This is the part people want described as heroic, and I would rather be honest. I was not brave, I was employed. I knew where the emergency release sat on that vehicle because I had signed the procurement paperwork on the whole fleet 4 years earlier, and I knew that breaking the rear quarter glass instead of the door glass would not immediately flood the compartment. I put the pry bar through the corner, cleared the opening, reached in, and pulled the interior release. She came out sideways and went under for 2 seconds. And I got her by the collar and then by the harness, and the moment the vehicle lost her weight it lost its argument with the flood and slid backward into the ditch, rolling once, going dark. Vivienne started to turn her head to watch it go. I took her jaw in my hand, turned her face back toward mine, and said the only useful thing available. "Don't look at the water. Look at me." She looked at me, and I have never been looked at with that much attention by anyone. We could not go back to the truck, which was now on the far side of a channel that had become a river. Instead, I walked her south along a maintenance fence line, hand over hand on the top rail, 40 yards at a time. There is an old equipment shed on that stretch, corrugated, sitting on a raised concrete pad from the original 1999 construction phase, and I got the door open with a bolt cutter I had clipped to my belt out of habit. No power, no signal, no comfort of any kind. Just a dry floor 18 inches above the waterline, which at that hour was the most valuable real estate in North Carolina. We sat on that pad for 9 hours while the storm walked over the top of us. The metal skin of the building breathed in and out with the pressure changes, and every so often something struck the west wall hard enough to leave a dent visible from inside. Vivienne shook for the first 2 hours, partly cold and partly the thing that happens after your body has decided you were going to die and then has to revise. I rationed the water, checked the roof fasteners, stacked 2 pallets against the door, and used the first aid kit on a cut she had not noticed getting. Somewhere around midnight, she asked the question that changed everything. She asked how I had known the shed was there. I told her I had read the original flood relief schematics for the county years ago, that structures like it always sit on raised pads where 2 service easements cross, and that my father had taught me to read that kind of drawing when I was 9 years old at a kitchen table in Delaware. She asked if my father had been an engineer. I said yes. She asked his name. I said Thomas Harlan. The name went into the room and did nothing at all. She nodded and asked something else about the tide timing, and I answered, and the storm kept going, and neither of us understood that a fuse had just been lit under a building 900 miles north of us. By 2 in the morning, the wind had dropped enough that we could talk without raising our voices. She asked why a man who could read a hydrological schematic and improvise a rescue was coordinating radio batteries for a living. I did not give her the speech. There is a version where the underappreciated man explains at length how the world wronged him, and I have heard other men give it, and it never once made anybody respect them more. I told her I had finished 3 years of civil engineering, that my wife had died when our daughter was 4, and that I had chosen a job ending at 6 o'clock over a career that ended whenever it felt like it. She was quiet a while. Then she said she had not known I had a daughter, and I said that was not a criticism of her, it was a description of the building. 11,000 people worked there. No chief executive knows 11,000 families, but she pushed back on her own behalf, which surprised me, and admitted she knew the names of every director's children and could not have named one field employees. That is not scale, she said. That is selection. It was the first genuinely uncomfortable thing I ever heard her say. Then she talked about the deal, maybe because there was nothing left to be private about. Blackwood Meridian was carrying debt from Ohio and Louisiana. The Tidewall Patent Group, the flood pressure control technology that had underwritten 30 years of growth, was the cleanest asset on the books, and Carrington Capital had offered $2.4 billion for it. She described it the way a surgeon describes an amputation. She said pressure explains things, and I said the sentence that ended the conversation. Pressure explains a bad decision. It doesn't turn a bad decision into a good one. She did not answer. I watched her file it somewhere. What I did not know and would not learn for another 11 days was that she had heard a version of that sentence before, in a story her father told badly and rarely, about a man who had said it to him across a conference table in 1997 and then walked out of the company he had helped build. Rescue found us at 6:40 in the morning by the transponder in the abandoned field truck. We came out into a landscape that had been rearranged, the coastal road gone in 3 places, the canal running through what had been a parking lot. Somebody had alerted corporate, and there was a communications officer at the staging area with a phone raised and a very specific photograph in mind. I walked around her and declined every interview for the next 2 weeks. I was not being noble. I had been awake 26 hours and I wanted my own kitchen and my daughter. 900 miles north, on the 41st floor of a glass tower in Philadelphia, Graham Blackwood was handed the incident report at 8:15 Wednesday morning. He was 72. He had built Blackwood Meridian from an 11-person engineering shop into an infrastructure empire, and he read documents faster than his assistants could hand them over. He read the summary. He read the personnel line identifying the employee who performed the extraction, and then he stopped, all the way a machine stops when something metal gets into it. The name on the line was Caleb Thomas Harlan. His assistant later told me the coffee cup in his hand descended to the desk at roughly the speed of a leaf, that he looked at my photograph for a dozen seconds without moving his eyes, and that when he finally spoke he was not speaking to her. He said, "It can't be him." She asked if he was all right. He put the report face down, which she had never seen him do with anything, and said, "Get me every personnel file this man has ever appeared in." I was summoned to the executive floor the following Tuesday. In 11 years I had never been above the 6th floor of that building. I assumed I was going to be thanked, and I had decided to receive it politely and briefly, and without asking for anything, because asking would have converted a rescue into an invoice. Graham Blackwood did not thank me. He stood up when I came in, which unsettled me, and he shook my hand too long and looked at my face the way a person looks at a photograph they have not seen since childhood. Then he asked whether my father's name was Thomas Everett Harlan. I said yes, and asked how he knew. And this man who had spoken at industry conferences for 4 decades took a long moment to arrange a sentence. He said I built this company with him. I want to describe what that did, because it did not feel like a revelation. It felt like the floor changing temperature. My father died when I was 26, and in all the years I knew him he told me exactly this much about his career. That he had been an engineer for a construction firm in the 90s, that he had left after a professional disagreement, and that some arguments are not worth the years you spend explaining them. He never once said the word Blackwood in my presence. Graham told me the shape of it, and he told it well, because he had clearly told it to himself many times. In 1997, the company was 2 men and a rented floor above a tire warehouse. Graham brought the capital and the clients. Thomas Harlan brought everything else. He designed the differential pressure control system for tidal barriers that marketing would eventually name Tidewall, and that system is why a small shop became a company with 11,000 employees. Every dollar in that tower has some of my father's arithmetic in it. Then, Graham said, they disagreed. A major coastal contract in 1999, the investors demanding a 22% reduction in materials cost, a redesign that thinned the relief channel gate specifications, and changed the failure behavior of the pressure system under stained load. Thomas refused to sign the safety certification, not slowly, not with negotiation. A few months later, he left the company. His name came off the corporate history, out of the promotional material, off the patent narrative that got printed in every profile for the next 25 years. I asked Graham why he had never looked for the family. He said he had assumed Thomas had no heirs connected to the business, that Thomas had wanted that way, and that he had not wanted to find out otherwise. Then he offered the kind sentence he had probably rehearsed. Perhaps your father never told you because he didn't want you carrying his resentment. Maybe that was even true. But I have sat across from enough contractors to know when a man is telling me the whole story and when he is telling me the portion of it that survives daylight, and he was doing the second thing. Lenora Carrington was standing at the far end of the executive corridor when I came out. She was not waiting for an elevator. She said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Harlan," with a small considered emphasis on the surname, and I understood that the door had not been as closed as Graham thought. That evening, from a car on the way to an airport, she called her attorney and said 9 words that would eventually cost her everything. Find the Harlan settlement from 1999 tonight. Then Human Resources opened a formal procedural review. The official grounds were that I had left a designated safe vehicle during an active emergency in violation of Section 14 and used rescue equipment without incident commander authorization. Both statements were technically accurate. Every rescue in the history of that company violated Section 14, because the only way to pull somebody out of a flooded vehicle is to be out of your own. I read the notice twice and laughed, alone in a stairwell, because the alternative was worse. Vivienne found out on Tuesday. She read the notice standing up, called the chief people officer without sitting down, and instructed him to close it that afternoon. Lenore objected in writing within the hour, and the objection was surgical. A chief executive cannot suspend disciplinary procedure for the individual who happens to have saved her life, because that is precisely the circumstance in which procedure exists. It was, in a narrow sense, the correct argument. Vivienne's answer has been quoted to me by 4 different people, and I believe all 4 versions. She said, "If that man had got a procedure that day, I would have died in the back of a company vehicle." Close the review. That was the first time she stood in front of the organization and put her weight on my side, and it cost her immediately, because 2 directors took Lenora's note as evidence that the chief executive's judgment had been compromised by gratitude. But gratitude was never the engine. She had started checking. Quietly, at night through the corporate secretary's archive portal, she pulled everything carrying a 1999 date stamp, and she found something that stopped her the way the incident report had stopped her father. There were 41 documents from that period sitting in restricted archive, sealed under a retention classification that had been renewed 3 times by the chairman's office. One of them had a title, and the title was all she could see because the body of it required an authorization she did not possess, despite being the chief executive of the corporation that owned it. The title read, Harlan Technology Covenant. She requested access on a Thursday afternoon. The request was declined within 40 minutes by board counsel, citing an active advisory privilege. Vivienne Blackwood, who controlled a $12 billion enterprise, could not read a 27-year-old document with her own family's name attached to it, and the moment she understood that, she stopped treating this as a personnel matter and started treating it as an investigation. That same evening, at 11:40 at night, Lenora Carrington's attorney called her from a landline. He said, "We have a problem." She asked how large. He had located the 1999 settlement in a county court archive in Delaware, filed as part of an unrelated dispute and never sealed, and he had read it 4 times to be sure. Then he said the sentence that turned a transaction into a war. If Caleb Harlan is the direct heir, he can stop the entire sale. Not delay it. Stop it. Here is what my father did in 1999. And I did not learn it from Graham Blackwood, and I did not learn it from a lawyer. I learned it from a cardboard box in my aunt's attic in Wilmington, Delaware that had my father's handwriting on the side because Vivienne called me on a Friday and told me what she had seen the title of, and I drove 4 hours that night on the theory that a man who keeps a drafting table for 20 years keeps his paperwork too. He had not sued. He could have. There was an attorney's letter in that box laying out the case, and across the top he had written in pencil, "This takes 6 years and I have a son." Instead, he negotiated, and both sides had initialed every page. Blackwood Meridian received a perpetual, irrevocable license to use and commercialize the entire pressure control patent family. Thomas Harlan received 1.25%, paid into a trust account for 27 years because after 1999 he never gave them an address. And then there was Clause 9. Clause 9 said the underlying patent ownership could not be assigned, sold, or transferred to any third party without the written consent of Thomas Everett Harlan or his direct heir. My father did not want money. He wanted a hand on the wheel permanently in case the technology he built was ever sold to somebody who would treat it the way the 1999 investors had. For 27 years the clause was decorative. Then came 2 failed projects, a hole in the balance sheet, and a buyer named Carrington Capital. One signature stood between a $2.4 billion transaction and nothing at all, and the signature belonged to a field operations coordinator who drove a pickup with a cracked tailgate. I sat on that attic floor with the document across my knees for a long time, and what I felt was not triumph. It was a cold, specific anger, not about money. I had lived 39 years without it. It was that I had stood at my father's funeral in front of 90 people and described him as an engineer at a construction company, because that was all he had ever given me to say, and the reason he had nothing else to give me was sitting in a restricted archive in Philadelphia. I requested a meeting with Graham Blackwood, and I did not request it politely. We met in his office on a Monday morning with the door closed and no assistant present, and I put my father's copy of the covenant on his desk, and I watched a 72-year-old man recognize his own initials from another century. And then I asked him for the rest of the story, and this time he gave it to me, because there was nothing left to protect. The 1999 contract went forward with the reduced specification. It performed adequately for years, which is the most dangerous thing an inadequate design can do. Shortly after Thomas resigned, a minor failure occurred during commissioning on a secondary structure, and somebody needed to be responsible for it in the trade press. Information reached 2 industry publications suggesting the departing lead engineer had made a calculation error. It was not true. The specification that failed was the one my father refused to sign. Graham knew it was false within a week, and a correction would have required naming who approved the change, and he chose silence. I asked him the only question that mattered. "You let my father carry that so the company wouldn't have to. He did not defend himself, I will give him that much. And it matters more than people think," he said. "I told myself I would fix it when we were stable. Then we were stable and I told myself he had moved on." He said he had looked for Thomas exactly once, in 2004, and had stopped when he found out my father was teaching night classes at a community college in Delaware for $31,000 a year, because finding out had been worse than not knowing. I stood up. I said, "Then you didn't lose a co-founder in 1999. You chose to lose him." And I walked out, and I did not slam the door, because slamming the door would have let him make it about my temper. The part that turned this from a family grievance into something with a body count waiting to happen came 4 days later, when the damage assessment finished. The relief gate that overtopped and drowned the coastal road, the one that put Vivienne Blackwood inside a submerged vehicle, was a fourth-generation derivative of the reduced specification. Same thinned gate profile, same relief geometry, same failure mode under sustained load described by my father in a memorandum dated the 11th of March, 1999. He had written, "Under a sustained or exceeding the rated load by 15%, this configuration does not fail totally. It fails completely, and it fails at the gate seat, and everything downstream of it will be underwater before anyone downstream knows the gate is gone." That is exactly what happened on the 10th of October. My father predicted the flood that nearly killed the daughter of the man who erased him. In writing, before I finished high school, Lenora Carrington changed her approach the following week, and I have to acknowledge the craft of it. The contempt vanished completely. She telephoned me directly, called me Caleb, and invited me to dinner at a restaurant where the tables sit far enough apart that nobody hears anything. She spoke warmly about my father for 20 minutes. Then a leather folder came out of a bag and onto the tablecloth beside my water glass. Carrington Capital was prepared to pay me $12 million for a consent signature on the patent assignment. Not a settlement, not a claim. One signature, one page, wired within 5 business days. I want to be clear what that number meant to a man with a mortgage of $291,000 and a daughter 4 years from college. To the people at that table, it was pocket change. To me, it was every problem I had solved before dessert. Lenora watched me read. Then she delivered the line she had been carrying all evening, and she delivered it gently, which is what made it effective. "You can keep playing the hero," she said, "or you can make sure your daughter never has to think about money again." She did not sneer. She was, in that moment, genuinely offering me something, and part of her believed she was being kind. I read the whole document, which I do not think she expected, and it took 11 minutes, and she waded through all of them. What I found was a closing schedule. The signature had to be executed, and the transaction closed by the 22nd of November, with a penalty structure severe enough to function as a threat against her own side. So I put the folder down and asked the only question in my head. If Tidewall is worth $2.4 billion, why do you need my signature before the storm damage assessment is published? She did not answer. That silence lasted about 4 seconds, and it told me everything the document did not. Carrington Capital did not want the technology. It wanted the technology before the public learned that the deployed cost-reduced variants had a known failure mode, documented in 1999, demonstrated in October, and installed in 11 coastal systems across 4 states. Once the assessment was published, the patent family stops being an asset and becomes a liability with a plaintiff's bar attached. Buy it first at a clean valuation, and the exposure stays on Blackwood Meridian's balance sheet. It was not illegal. It was a man selling you a house 4 days before the inspection report comes back. I pushed the folder back across the tablecloth and said one word: no. The warmth left her face at a speed I have only otherwise seen in weather. She said, "You should remember who you are." And I said, "That is precisely what I've been doing," and I paid for my own dinner, which cost me $61 and was the best money I have ever spent. The email arrived at 6:14 the next morning. Subject line: Employment termination review effective immediately. Badge access suspended pending outcome. 19 days after I pulled the chief executive out of a flooded vehicle, and 4 days before the emergency board meeting, somebody was removing me from the building. Vivienne Blackwood spent that week inside the worst decision of her professional life. If she moved against Lenora Carrington, the transaction collapsed. The debt from Ohio and Louisiana came due without a plan, and the Carrington block, the second largest in the company, would be aimed directly at her chair. Directors who had known her since she was 9 years old would vote to remove her, sadly, over lunch, and one of them would call it a difficult but necessary reset. If she stayed quiet, the arithmetic worked. The deal closed, the balance sheet healed, I got pushed out with a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement. My father stayed a footnote, and 11 deployed flood control systems with a documented failure mode became someone else's legal problem. Nobody would ever be able to prove she had known. That is the thing about the comfortable path. It is almost always survivable, and it is almost always available, and it never once announces itself as the cowardly option. She came down to the operations floor on Thursday afternoon. Not a summons, not a conference room, not an assistant. The chief executive of Blackwood Meridian walked into a space with concrete floors and a coffee machine that had been broken since spring. And 40 people stopped what they were doing, and she asked me if I had 10 minutes. We stood between a parts rack and a pallet of sandbags, and she apologized, not for the termination review first. She apologized for the sentence. 9 months earlier, in a leadership meeting about headcount efficiency, someone had raised my department, and she had said, "He's a field coordinator. If he quit tomorrow, we could replace him in a week." Somebody had repeated it to me at the time, because somebody always does. She said she had remembered it on the concrete pad in that shed at about 3 in the morning, while I was rationing water and checking the roof, and that she had been unable to stop remembering it since. Then she said the thing I have thought about more than anything else she has ever said to me. "I built an entire career evaluating people through numbers," she said, "and I did not notice the moment I started evaluating their worth the same way." I accepted the apology. I did not accept her yet, and I told her so, because an apology delivered at a moment of maximum convenience is a strategy with feelings attached. I said, "Standing with me costs you nothing today. Tomorrow you will have to stand with the truth in a room where it could take your chair, and that is the only version of this that counts." She said, "I know." Then she went upstairs and spent 31 hours doing something I did not learn about until it was on the table. The emergency board meeting was convened for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning, and Lenora Carrington arrived with a 3-part plan. Approve the patent assignment under the board's general authority, ratify my termination as a routine personnel matter, and declare the 1999 covenant unenforceable on the grounds that it had never been recorded in the corporate register and that no successor consent had been sought in 27 years. 3 motions, 40 minutes, done before lunch. I owned one suit. I had bought it for my wife's funeral and worn it twice since. I put it on Tuesday morning in a bathroom on the 2nd floor because my badge would not open the locker rooms anymore, and I walked to the elevator bank on the executive side. Lenora was standing there with 2 directors, and she looked me over once, top to bottom, and said, at a volume calibrated to reach every person in that lobby, "The maintenance offices are on the lower level, Mr. Harlan." I did not look at her. I looked at the directory panel listing the boardroom on 42 and said, "I know where I'm going." Lenora Carrington presented first, and she was excellent. I want that recorded because making an opponent sound stupid afterward teaches nobody anything. She spoke for 19 minutes without notes. She characterized me precisely. A mid-level field employee with no legal standing, no engineering license, present at a fortunate moment, and busy converting that moment into leverage. She used the phrase opportunistic assertion of a dormant instrument. She noted that the trust royalty had never been claimed, which she framed as proof the family itself considered the arrangement void. 4 directors were nodding by the end. Then the chair recognized me, and I stood up in a suit that had been to 1 funeral, in a room with a table that cost more than my truck, in front of 11 people who between them controlled $12 billion. I did not mention the storm, not the vehicle, not the water, not the 9 hours. I did not mention the $12 million on a tablecloth 11 days earlier, though it was the strongest card in my hand, because playing it would have made the meeting about her character instead of about the thing that was going to hurt somebody. And I said nothing about my father being treated unfairly, because unfairness is an opinion, and opinions do not survive a boardroom. I opened the original 1999 drawings, then the current as-built drawings for the northern relief structure, and I walked 11 directors, none of them engineers, through exactly 3 differences: gate seat thickness, relief aperture geometry, and the load rating assumption in the design basis. Then I put up the October damage assessment and showed them the 2 places the system had failed, both at the gate seat. Both sustained load failures, both described in advance by mechanism and by location, in a memorandum dated the 11th of March, 1999. Then I said the only 2 sentences I had prepared: my father was not pushed out of this company because he was wrong. He was pushed out of this company because he would not say that something dangerous was safe. Vivienne Blackwood put a folder on the table. Inside was an internal risk advisory, generated by corporate engineering on the 29th of September, 11 days before the storm, flagging elevated failure probability at 3 relief structures on the North Carolina coastal system and recommending immediate operational review. It had been routed to the office of the vice chair for scheduling into the executive packet. It reached the chief executive on the 19th of October, 9 days after the flood. The distribution log carried a hold entry, and the hold entry carried a name, a timestamp, and a reason code, pending transaction sensitivity. Nobody caused the storm. Nobody wanted anybody hurt. What happened is smaller and more ordinary than a conspiracy, and it is the reason most disasters happen. A report that would have delayed a transaction was held for 11 days by a person who had decided that the transaction was the more urgent risk. 6 people drove onto that road because a warning sat in an inbox. It was enough. Lenora did not concede. I have never seen anyone so completely refuse to look at a document. She turned to the board and said, with real force, that she would not have a $2.4 billion decision dictated by a logistic employee in a cheap suit who has walked into a room he does not belong in. The room went absolutely silent. Not shocked. Exactly. Waiting. Graham Blackwood. He was 72. He had not spoken in 50 minutes, and it took him a moment to get all the way vertical. He looked at me for a long time. Then he turned and looked down the length of that table at Lenora Carrington and said, in a voice that did not rise at all, his father helped build this room. Nobody said anything for 11 full seconds. I counted them, because there was a clock on the credenza behind Lenora's chair, and I had nowhere else to put my eyes. Independent counsel confirmed the covenant 9 days later, and the confirmation was not close. The instrument was validly executed, supported by consideration, recorded in a Delaware County filing, and enforceable against successors. Clause 9 held. The patent family could not be assigned without my written consent, and my written consent was not available at any price, which I communicated in a single sentence and did not elaborate on. The Carrington transaction was suspended and then, 11 weeks later, formally terminated. The board voted 7-2, with 2 abstentions, to open an independent investigation into the suppression of the September advisory. Lenora Carrington was suspended from every executive and committee position for the duration. There was no arrest and no collapse in a hallway. She resigned 4 months later, citing a desire to focus on family philanthropy. Her undoing came entirely out of documents she had assumed a logistic employee would never be able to read, which is the most precise possible summary of this entire matter. Graham Blackwood then did the thing he should have done 27 years earlier, and he did it without being asked, which I have decided to count. The corporate history was formally revised. Both trade publications that had run the 1999 story published corrections, and the corrections were not buried. A new line was added to the company's founding record and to every future profile of the technology that made it rich. Thomas Everett Harlan, co-founder and lead engineer, Tidewall Technology. The trusted account was reconciled and released to me through the proper process. 27 years of a 1.25% royalty on a technology deployed in 9 states, and I am not going to say the figure out loud because the figure is the least interesting fact in this entire story. I paid off a mortgage. I set up my daughter's education. I bought a truck that starts every time, and I kept the old one which my daughter finds inexplicable and which I have not attempted to explain. I did not. Vivienne offered me something instead, and she offered it in writing, having clearly anticipated that I would refuse anything that resembled a gift. Director of Infrastructure Resilience, a new function reporting to the chief executive, with authority across every deployed system the company owned. I took 2 weeks and then accepted it with 3 conditions, all of which went into the charter as binding language. First, any licensed safety engineer in the company has unilateral authority to halt work on any project at any hour, without prior executive approval, and cannot be overruled except by a documented vote of the full board. Second, no technical risk advisory may be delayed, filtered, or held at any level between the originating engineer and the chief executive, and every advisory carries an automatic timestamp delivery receipt. Third, a training and scholarship fund for engineering students entering public infrastructure work, endowed at $15 million, carrying my father's name. Vivienne agreed to all 3 before I finished reading the second one. 7 months later, I stood on the northern barrier section on a Tuesday in May, and the water was flat and green and completely uninterested in any of us. The relief structures had been rebuilt to the original 1999 specification, the one that was never signed, at a cost of $31 million the company absorbed without a press release. All 11 deployed systems in 4 states were remediated over 14 months. The catastrophe that does not happen never gets a name. Graham came down for the dedication of the new technical center, walking more slowly than he had in the fall. There is a plate mounted beside rather than printed, because I was specific about that. The Thomas, Harlan Resilience. He stood behind me while I looked at it, and neither of us said anything for a while, and then he said the only honest thing available to him. "I can't give your father back the years." I kept looking at the plate. I said, "No, you can't." Then I said the rest of it, and I meant it as an instruction rather than as forgiveness, because forgiveness was not mine to hand out on my father's behalf. "But you can make certain it doesn't happen to the next one." He nodded, and he did not try to make it into a moment. That was the redemption available to him. Not absolution, not a speech, not my hand on his shoulder. Just a specific job assigned to a man who had run out of time to do anything else, and he did it. He spent the last stretch of his working life personally reviewing every safety escalation in the company in writing every week. Vivienne walked up the path a few minutes later with a project folder under her arm and sunglasses pushed into her hair, and we stood there, the 3 of us, and a plate with my father's name on it. There has never been a kiss. There has never been a scene. There is something, and both of us know there is something, and neither of us has been in any hurry because the thing between us was built out of 9 hours on a concrete pad, and it does not require acceleration. She handed me the folder. A barrier project in coastal Georgia, $400 million, preliminary design phase, and a review deadline that was already unreasonable. And she said, "I need an opinion from the least replaceable person in this company." I laughed. Out loud, on a seawall, in front of the chairman. She had chosen that sentence deliberately, and she had waited 7 months to use it, and I have never been able to decide whether that was an apology or a joke, and I have concluded it was both, which is the most Vivienne Blackwood possible answer. My phone buzzed against my leg. A text message from my daughter, 12 now, asking what time I was going to be home, because she had made something involving a slow cooker and had questions about whether it was supposed to look like that. I checked my watch. 4:20. Vivienne saw my face and said, "Another meeting." I said, "The important one." And I walked back down the path toward the parking area while the sun came down low and orange over the water, past the poured concrete and the new gate housings and the fresh painted markings on the maintenance easement, and I did not look back, because there was nothing behind me that needed watching anymore. She stayed a while, I'm told, in front of the steel plate with the name cut into it, the name taken out of the history of Blackwood Meridian in 1999, gone for 27 years. It did not come back because of money, and it did not come back because of power. It came back because of the sun everybody in that building had been perfectly certain could be replaced inside of a week.